Glory to Ukraine, greetings to all watching Apostrophe TV. Today we have a special guest, retired Major General in the Australian Army and authoritative military expert Mick Ryan. Mr. Mick, it's good to see you. Thank you for supporting our country and thank you for coming to Kiev at this difficult time for Ukraine.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be back here again.
Thank you so much. So let's start our conversation. The brutal and cynical full-scale war launched by Russia has been going on for more than 1 year, and a lot has changed in this time. How can you assess the current situation with regards to the counteroffensive potential of the Ukrainian Armed Forces and the offensive potential of the aggressor country, Russia, and what should we expect in the coming months?
Well, the Russians commenced an offensive, I think, in January across the east of Ukraine. It's been not as big as expected. It's been more dispersed, and the Ukrainian Armed Forces, as difficult as it has been and as bloody as it has been, have been able to really limit Russian advances so far. That's a good thing. In many respects, the Ukrainian Armed Forces are, on one hand, holding off the Russian offensive whilst preparing for their own counter-offensives in the coming months.
Okay, so we all understand and we all know that Bakhmut is one of the hottest spots on the front line, and it's a fortress city thanks for the heroism and unbreakable of our Ukrainian defenders. In your opinion, is there no alternative to holding Bakhmut, and how critical can the issue of Ukrainian army in this area be for morale and in general?
Well, it's a very difficult situation. I mean, the Russian invaders are trying to surround Bakmut. They're causing a lot of casualties to the Ukrainian defenders, but Ukraine is causing far, far more casualties to Russia. And indeed, Russia's taken far longer to capture Bakmut than it probably ever expected. It's lost a lot more soldiers than it expected, and I expect that the Ukrainian Armed Forces and the Commander-in-Chief are using it to really ensure the Russians use up as many of their forces there as they can, so they can't use them in other places against Ukraine. There may be a point where Ukraine decides to withdraw, but it doesn't appear to be at that point just yet.
Mr. Mick, according to your words, the Australian doctrine said that it will be, a quote, "A withdrawal is a task regularly employed during mobile defense or delayed to achieve the overall objective to offer human offensive actions. It should be treated as a routine tactic, not as harbinger of disaster." So the likely withdrawal of Ukrainian defenders from Bakhmut will not be a harbinger of disaster. How do you think?
If Ukraine does decide to withdraw its troops, and I don't know whether it will or won't, it may decide to because it wants to reserve its forces for future offensives. I don't think it would be a strategic issue. I mean, yes, it's always awful to give up your own territory and your own citizens, and you know the president on downwards would be very cognizant of that. But it wouldn't be a strategic disaster. It would not be the same as Ukraine losing the war at all. It just means Ukraine would be realigning its forces as it anticipates going on the offensive in future. But we're not sure that they may even withdraw at this point. The Russians haven't won the Battle of Bakmut yet.
As we said, Bakhmut is one of the hottest spots on the front line, but we also need to remember other cities. So also, if we're talking about Withdrawal, about Avdiivka, how do you think about the situation near these cities and the scenario of what it can be in also certain months?
Well, the Russians certainly are trying to undertake offensive operations there, as well as Crimea as well. They're not having a lot of success. They're making minor gains, if any, but the Ukrainian Armed Forces, the army in particular, is really hurting the Russian army in these offensives. So, you know, I expect in the coming month or so, the Russian army may not be able to sustain these offensives to the degree that they have.
Because they have lack of what? Of weapons, or their army is not so strong now?
Well, they lose a lot of soldiers. They've lost a lot of equipment. Vuhledar in particular, they've lost a huge number of armoured vehicles, as well as first-line Russian troops, including their Marines, and that hurts an army a lot. So, at some point they will run out of supplies, their artillery will run short, and they'll culminate in this overall offensive.
And what do you think about conflict inside Russia?
It's fascinating to see, especially some of the things he is saying publicly about the Russian army. In a military organisation, we like to achieve what's called unity of command, which is everyone on the same page with a single objective. The Russian army and Wagner clearly are not on the same page at the moment, and Prigozhin's public comments must very much irritate senior Russian military leaders and probably the president, so he's going to have to watch what he says in future.
How do you think, is it possible to create the conditions of Ukraine's victory, I mean the occupation of all territory as early as 2023? If so, what are these conditions?
Well, it has to take back territory. At the end of the day, Russia's made it very clear that it's not going to give back the territory it's illegally seized in Ukraine. So the Ukrainian Armed Forces are going to have to take it back from them in the east and in the south. We shouldn't forget that both the east and the south are very important to the Ukrainian people. So I think, you're going to see offensives potentially in both areas over the coming months. Because naturally the Ukrainian people want all of its territory back in the Donbass in the south, and eventually Crimea.
Mm-hmm. The Crimea, the occupation of Crimea is an inevitable component of Ukrainians' war against the Russian invaders, and we understand that everything will depend on how the war will proceed, but what is your vision of the way to liberate Crimea? How should this happen?
Well, first, Ukraine would have to recapture its territory in the south. Kherson and Zaporizhia territory must be taken back, because that would be an important precursor event for anything in Crimea. But if Ukraine does capture its southern territories, it is able to place at risk with long-range artillery, with missiles and other military capabilities, pretty much all of Crimea. Hopefully at that point the Russians may decide it's not worth staying in Crimea. That would be the preference, but the threat of a military invasion as well would always be there. But Crimea, I think, would be potentially the last campaign of this war, whether it's an invasion or whether the Russians leave because it's no longer tenable for them to stay.
Mm-hmm. The greater the fear of Russians in Crimea, the deeper their trenches are, as we said. Before our interview, we're talking about missiles, and for us, as I said, the big disappointment is the lack of long-range precision weapons to hit Russian command post and logistics center deep in the Russians' rear. This was also mentioned by a former U.S. Army commander in Europe, Ben Hodges. Why do you think our partners are hesitating? After all, long-range precision munitions will allow destroying the actual breach to Crimea across the Kerch Strait, which was partially damaged by still unexplained explosions in October in 2022.
Yes, very mysterious.
Yes.
I don't see any reason why Ukraine shouldn't be given long-range precision missiles. For a couple of reasons. First, Ukrainian Armed Forces should be able to target any Russian target on Ukrainian soil, whether that is in the east, the south, or Crimea. That is their choice, and they should be able to do that. I think there are fears in some parts of the West with politicians that Ukraine might use it to attack Russia. Well, I think we've already proven that Ukraine has been a very responsible stakeholder since this war began. It has fought a just war. It's fought within the conventions and laws of armed conflict. It has chosen not to attack Russian targets or Russian cities, whereas the Russians have done it throughout this war. So I think, Ukraine has proven itself to be a very responsible user of these long-range precision munitions, and they should be given them.
I hope. And what are the consequences for Russia after the strikes on Russian air bases deep in Russia? What are the consequences?
I think, it was an interesting attack. I think Ukraine was looking at would it be able to do this. It's proved it can conduct long-range strikes. We saw the drone land
for example, yes.
on the Russian aircraft in Belarus as well. So what Ukraine is saying to the Russian military is we can reach out and touch you a long way away, but we're only going to target military capabilities. We're not ever going to target citizens or civilians in Russia because we are not Russians.
Yes, it's true, we're not Russians. And since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Ukraine has received a dozen of weapons from its allies. And since the end of February, the first Western-made battle tanks, Leopard 2, have already begun to arrive in Ukraine. We have not seen them yet on the battlefield. We hope that this will happen soon. How do you think these tanks can radically change the situation of the battlefield right now?
I think they can have a very significant impact. I mean, Ukraine has a lot of its own tanks from the Soviet era, but the more you use them, and you used them a lot in the last year, they do wear out. So having new, fresh tanks that have got very good optics, very good weapon systems to be able to punch through Russian defences and penetrate deep into their rear areas to attack command and control, to attack concentrations of troops, to attack logistics hubs, will be a very important capability, and it'll be needed in both the east and the south for large-scale recapturing of Ukrainian territory in the offensives to come.
And in addition to tanks and precision weapons, our country needs airplanes. One of the most experienced U.S. military pilots, Dan Hampton, who is called the deadliest F-16 pilot, has voiced an idea that would help quickly turn the airspace of Ukraine into a no-fly zone for Russians. He suggested that Western private pilots should be allowed to pilot F-16 in Ukraine, and he's ready to defend Ukrainian skies personally. What do you think of this idea, and what about Australian pilots?
Well, firstly, I think the commitments by Poland and other countries of their MiG-29s in the last week is to be welcomed. I mean, Ukraine's aircraft have been used a lot, and aircraft do wear out, so I think that's good. But at the end of the day, the Ukrainian Air Force will need aircraft that can match it and overmatch the Russian Su-35, which has very long-range sensors, very long-range weapons, and something like the F-16 may be able to provide that, where Ukraine can take back the skies, close the skies to any Russian aircraft, and then use its own airspace to defend itself in its future offensives. So I think that's important. I think the Ukrainian Air Force has a lot of very good pilots. They're very experienced. It may not actually need foreign pilots. I'll leave that up to the politicians and President Zelensky about whether he wants to welcome in foreign pilots as well. I think training Ukrainian soldiers overseas is important for several reasons. Firstly, it takes some pressure off the training system of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, which is very, very busy when you are expanding the size of your military like Ukraine has done. But it also exposes the soldiers to different ideas, to different countries, which is good because they can bring them back into the Ukrainian Armed Forces. I think it's a program that NATO can probably expand to train more Ukrainian soldiers, whether it's basic training, whether it's training leaders, training staffs as well for planning. But I think it's a really important contributions that many countries can make. I know Australia's helping in the United Kingdom, but many countries I think are doing training for Ukrainian soldiers that will be an important part of Ukraine's eventual victory.
So as you said, really Australian soldiers are training our Ukrainian soldiers in United Kingdom, and it will be continued, or that's all?
I hope so. It'll be a requirement that will be ongoing for a while, but you're seeing other countries like Spain and Germany training Ukrainian soldiers to use Leopard 2 tanks. The United States is training Ukrainians to operate Patriot missile batteries and other systems that they are providing Ukraine.
member.
Yes. So it's a really important program, but probably one that should be continued and potentially expanded in the coming year.
You once noted that every medium-sized country with limited resources can learn a lot from Ukrainian defenders. Learn what exactly, and what is it that you can single out as unique about our army during the long-lasting confrontation with Russian aggression, with the Russian Federation?
Well, there's a lot of things that we can learn from Ukraine as well as Ukrainian Armed Forces. As a nation, your national unity is something to admire, but also national resilience, how your telecommunications have been hardened and keep working even though the Russians try to shut it down, how your civil defence and emergency services are able to rapidly repair power lines after these Russian attacks over the last few months. I mean, there are a lot of lessons in that. You know, the performance of firefighters and ambulance under terrible conditions is something we can learn from. But in the military, the ability of the Ukrainian Armed Forces to learn and adapt quickly from the battlefield is very important. Its ability to absorb new technologies like drones and combine them with old technologies has been very impressive and something to watch. So there are a lot of lessons, not just from the military, but as a nation, that many of us can watch from afar, admire, but also bring back to our home countries.
Mr. Mick, and also a little bit about Putin. The International Criminal Court in The Hague has issued an arrest warrant against Russian President Vladimir Putin. What does it mean for you, especially what can happen to Putin after this order?
Well, I think it means he can never travel overseas again, hopefully. I would love to see him before the International Criminal Court. Whether he will or not, I'm not sure. But I think it's a symbol that every war criminal in this war from Russia who have perpetrated crimes against the Ukrainian people should never rest again. That we should never stop hunting them, just as Israel did with Nazis after the war. Those who've perpetrated these repulsive crimes against Ukrainian people should never be free, and they should always be hunted down.
But also we see Putin makes a surprise trip to Russian-occupied Mariupol, Ukrainian. Mariupol in the wake of ICC warrant. Maybe even you saw this picture, Hitler in Mariupol 1941 and Putin in Mariupol 2023. What do you think about the purpose of this visit, and don't you think this is his last trip?
Well, Putin snuck in the middle of the night so no one would know. There were no welcoming crowds for Putin there. There was no one cheering for him when he arrived. You know, I think it's the action of someone who's desperate, someone who hasn't had the courage to visit his troops at the front like President Zelensky did at Bakmut and other locations. I think it says everything about his character as, you know, just a poor human and a poor leader. That's Vladimir Putin.
After this, the leader of China, Xi Jinping, came to Russia, to Moscow. What do you think about this visit, about the purpose, and what really the goals of this?
Well, I think President Xi and Putin had a friendship pact just before the Olympics. I don't know that President Xi had a lot of information about this invasion. I don't think he was very happy. And I think he's going there to reinforce the fact that Russia has been weakened by this. And whilst China is their friend, I think Xi very quietly would be happy to have a weakened Russia on his border, because it makes Russia a client state of China in the future. So
we're talking about support from China to Russia, and now if we're talking about Iran and Russia, about their relationships, and how you can also describe this, and about drones that Iran gave to Russia.
Yeah, I think Iran providing drones to Russia is troubling. I mean, I'm not sure why they feel that they need to do this for Russia. It's entirely unnecessary, and they're being used to terrorise civilians in Ukraine. So what Iran's doing is wrong. Now, luckily, the Ukrainian Armed Forces are able to destroy the vast majority of them before they hit their targets. But Russia is desperate for weapons. It's run out of a lot of the stocks that it built up over the Cold War, particularly ammunition. It's withdrawn a lot already from Belarus. It's drawn a lot of its armoured vehicles out of those stocks. So it's really shredded a lot of its stockpiles. Increasingly, it will be turning to places like North Korea and China for munitions and weapons systems. Whether they'll be provided is another story altogether.
You said about Belarus. We know that Alexander Lukashenko also helped Russia with tanks, with soldier also. How do you think about the second invasion from the territory of Belarus? They can do it or not?
I think it's unlikely in the short term or even the medium term. I mean, the Russians are sending forces to train in Belarus. They've been doing that for some time now, probably continue to do that. I think we'd see a large concentration of Russian forces for that, just like we did before the commencement of the other full-scale invasion in February 2022. So I don't think it's highly likely, but I'm pretty sure the Ukrainian High Command will be keeping one eye on that northern border just in case.
Yeah, I hope so, because they have, I think, 9,000 or 7,000 of soldiers near the Ukraine, and it's not enough to make another full-scale invasion as we see on February 24.
Yes.
So what do you think about next year, 2024? Do you think that war, it not will be a war in 2024, it will be a victory of Ukraine in 2023?
I think this war is going to continue, mainly because both Russia and Ukraine have a lot of people, have a lot of industrial resources, but also they have a lot of will. I mean, Ukraine is not going to surrender. I mean, it is going to fight on until it kicks the Russians out. But equally, it appears the Russians are keen to continue this war for as long as it takes. So as much as I would like to see a Ukrainian victory in 2023, I do fear that this war may go on beyond 2023 and into 2024.
You think that it will be continuing like missiles attack on territory of Ukraine or something like that?
I think it will continue with what we're seeing at the moment. There'll be ground operations, there'll be missile attacks, there'll be information operations, cyber attacks, and a whole range of things we probably don't see. Russia will be continuing to try and do diplomacy in Africa and South Asia and other places. Ukraine will continue its diplomacy with NATO and the United States to sustain support. But I do think this war, unfortunately, will be going on for some time to come. It
will be like with the country Israel?
I hope not. I mean, Israel is a very small country that's under a perpetual threat from many of its neighbours, unfortunately. I think Ukraine has a lot of neighbours that have only good intentions towards it. Like Poland and other countries that have provided an enormous amount of support. Unfortunately, even when Ukraine wins this war, Russia is still there. And it will remain some kind of threat for a long time to come. So we need to think about what kind of security guarantees will Ukraine need after the war, what kind of military will it need, and what kind of alliances might Ukraine be part of to deter future Russian threats.
How do you think how we can and how we need to live with this neighbor? Unfortunately, Russia, Belarus, it's our this country which near us.
Yes, unfortunately, you can't tow Ukraine away from Russia and Belarus. Somehow, Ukraine is going to have to live with the presence of Russia, but to have the capability to deter future aggression. I mean, that's very important. It's better to deter aggression than defend an invasion like you're having to do at the moment. I'm sure there are people who are thinking about this, but first and foremost in the President and the Commander-in-Chief's minds and the Minister's mind will be win this war, and then I guess we can think about the longer-term alliance and deterrence framework for Ukraine.
We believe in our President and in our Commander, so I think that everything will be all right, and we see that all over the world support our country, and it's very important. So thank you so much.
No, thank you.
And also about the joint announcement by President Joe Biden and Prime Ministers Anthony Albanese and Rishi Sunak in San Diego of the multi-decade collaboration of Virginia and SSN, AUKUS class submarines. Is it a seminal moment in the relationship between the United States of America, the United Kingdom, and also Australia?
Yeah, both the United Kingdom and the United States are very close to Australia. They're close allies. We have a long historical association. We've fought alongside each other for over a century. So what this announcement is just a closer alignment, especially in technical collaboration. Sharing of nuclear propulsion is one of the crown jewels of the United States. It doesn't do this very often, so it is a seminal moment in Australian strategic history. I think it's a very important move, but it's just one part of a very close relationship that involves technical collaboration beyond submarines, as well as people-to-people relationships, which are also very important.
And also about relationship between the United States, the United Kingdom and Australia, and about the relationship between Ukraine and Australia.
Well, I think before this war, the people of Ukraine and people of Australia probably didn't know each other, and that in both directions. But since the beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion, there's no Australian that doesn't know what Ukraine is, what it stands for, and where it is. There's a lot of support in Australia for our assistance to Ukraine, whether it's military or humanitarian. I think there's a lot of support for that continuing into the long term. And so there should be. I mean, this is the right fight, and we should be on the side of a people who are willing to stand up and defend themselves like Ukraine is.
Mr. Mick, thank you so much for this conversation and for your professional opinion about the war in Ukraine. I'm also very glad about release soon of your new novel, White Sun War, the campaign for Taiwan, from Casemate Pub. Can you tell about your book a little bit? And for our viewers, this futuristic fiction thriller will be able in April, but it can be pre-ordered, as you said, at Casemate and http://amazon.com. So welcome to our audience.
Yeah, thank you. It's just a book that really uses a lot of the lessons from the war in Ukraine to project forward a few years, to think about if there's a war over Taiwan, what might that look like, and what have we learned from the war in Ukraine for future conflicts. So it does that in a fictional sense. It's designed to have a lot of factual information in there, but provide a fictional context so people might enjoy reading it more than a highly technical manual. So it'll come out the 30th of April, and I hope people enjoy it.
I hope so. Mr. Mick, I'm sure that this won't be our last conversation. Thank you so much again. Take care of yourself and see you soon. Retired Australian General and authoritative military expert Mick Ryan was with us today. Thank you so much. And
thank you.
See you soon.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.